Zechariah and his wife Elizabeth never had children, and with Elizabeth past the age of childbearing, they thought they would never have children. But God had other plans for them. God was waiting for the right time to finally bless the couple with, well, not just a child, but a son that would play an important part in the story of the Messiah. You must always remember that God's timing is perfect, and it's never too late for him to fulfill his plans. There are 3 key points in this lesson. Number 1, Zechariah and Elizabeth are just like Abraham and Sarah. Abraham and Sarah had waited decades to become parents, yet the years passed and they had no children. Although God promised Abraham he would have children, neither he nor Sarah believed because they were too old. Still, when the time was right, God gave them a son, Isaac. Zechariah and Elizabeth were also well beyond the age when couples had children. This was especially true of Elizabeth, who was beyond the age when women were able to bear children. Elizabeth was unhappy because she had not been able to have children. As with Abraham and Sarah, though, God was waiting for the right time, his time, to bless Zechariah and Elizabeth with a son. Number 2, like Abraham's son, Zechariah's son ushered in a new age. The birth of Isaac brought the birth of God's chosen people. Isaac was the first of many descendants of Abraham, the beginning of a tradition that continues through today. Zechariah's son John signaled the beginning of a new age. John was the voice in the wilderness foretold in the Old Testament. John would be the one preparing the way for Jesus, talking about the one that would follow him. John helped turn the eyes of the people to the kingdom of God, telling them they needed to turn from their old ways, their sinful ways. John was one of the original voices of Advent, speaking of the coming of the Lord. And number 3, time is not a factor with God. Zechariah and Elizabeth never thought they would have children. They knew Elizabeth was past the age of childbearing, yet the angel told Zechariah he and Elizabeth were going to have a child, a son. Such a blessing on an elderly couple who would never have dreamed such a thing could happen to them. Yet God's timing is always perfect. Elizabeth may have been too old in human terms, but not in God's terms. God knew the part Elizabeth's son, John, would play in the ministry of Jesus. John was born at the right time to fulfill his role in Jesus' story. Now, what about faith versus fear? Well, we often let the idea of time frighten us. We worry about being too young. We worry about being too old. We're concerned there isn't enough time for us to accomplish all that must be done. Zechariah's story is about time. Although it seemed that time had passed for Elizabeth to bear any children, God thought the time was just right. God's timing is always perfect. Even when it seems to you that the time for something has come and gone, if God is saying now, then now is the right time. You are never too old to accomplish God's plan, and that's the way He wants it. The Bible has stories of people that thought their time had passed, but God had other ideas. Sarah and Elizabeth gave birth when they were old women. Simeon spent years in the temple waiting to see the Messiah as God had promised. The promise was fulfilled when Simeon was a very old man. There are even stories of young people who didn't seem qualified to do the job, and yet God disagreed. Young David defeated the Philistine when grown men were too afraid to step up. Young Jesus debated the law with the temple elders as a young boy. Timothy thought he was too young to continue the ministry of Paul. Time has no meaning to God. He only knows when there is a need and the perfect person to fulfill that need. When He says now, it's not for you to question. It's time to step up like young Samuel and say, "Here I am, Lord." Today you worry that time has passed for you to accomplish anything special, to fulfill the work God has called you to do. You have to remember that time has no meaning to God. Even if you've put off answering the call God has placed on your heart, it doesn't mean it's too late. God keeps molding you to fit His need, and when the time is right, He will give you what you need, including the courage and faith to step up and answer His call.